Welcome everyone to the first session of the Space Syntax Lab seminar for this academic year. Today, I'd like to welcome Mariana Diniz. She will introduce her work on a new GIS-based tool that applies quantitative parameters to the classic concept of morphological regions in urban planning, streamlining the traditional labor-intensive analysis of urban patterns. And by testing the tool in São Paulo, her research aims to offer a more efficient method for identifying homogeneous urban types. And Mariana holds an MSc in architecture and urban planning and is currently a PhD candidate at the Research Center for Territory, Transport and Environment, short CITA, in Portugal. And she's doing her PhD in the spatial planning doctoral program under the supervision of Miguel Serra. Many of you might have seen his keynote at the last Space Syntax Symposium in Nicosia. And before we start, we will have a Q&A at the very end. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat so we can address them after the presentation. And with this, I'd like to hand over to you, Mariana. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude for the opportunity to present at the Space Syntax Lab seminar. And I'm happy to share my PhD research and also discuss the insights and findings that have emerged from it. I'm currently in the final stages of my PhD, so every feedback, questions are welcomed. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you find this presentation both interesting and engaging. So when we explore the field of urban form classification, it is a common approach to identify patterns by clustering all elements together. Sometimes one can weight elements differently, or perhaps just cluster all the numeric information at once and identify the emergent patterns from the data. But that's not the only approach. In fact, we can learn and borrow valuable insights from traditional methods in urban morphology. And with that in mind, if we look at the concept of morphological regions within the Kanzian School of Urban Morphology, we'll find a hierarchical approach to urban form classification and the combination of individual types to form regions of morphological types. And here we connect with the title of our presentation, From Types to Regions, a GIS tool for spatial analysis. So individual types combine to form regions of homogeneous types. And as Kim mentioned, this work is supervised by Miguel Serra. So my talk today is divided into 4 parts. We're going to go through an introduction, so the framework, urban morphology, the concept of morphological regions. Then we go through the method, the procedures. We'll be testing all these procedures and the whole method in São Paulo in a large case study. And finally, the discussion and some considerations. So we're going to start with the introduction. We all know that as cities change and evolve in time, the urban form carries within itself a set of patterns encoding an unique identity. And this identity will vary, obviously, depending on geographical and historical contexts. But as we can, just through visual appraisal, identify these different patterns, our assumption is that we can also numerically and objectively define these patches. Because in fact, these patches or regions, as we could also call it, they are areas of a high intensity of spatial clustering among its morphological elements. And this is exactly our research problem. So one might ask, why is it important to define these patches? We can take, for instance, different perspectives to justify the relevance of identifying these regions of homogeneous types. If we take, for instance, urban heritage perspective, by defining these patches, we are also providing sound theoretical basis to support the geographical delimitation of historical urban tissues. if we analyze it from a different perspective, for example, planning and design, we're also providing a descriptive spatial analysis of the existing built form. And at the same time, we can also provide prescriptive morphological codes based on what is already in the city in order to develop new projects and guidelines to support these changes. From perspective of cities and public agencies, we're also providing them with a geospatial toolkit with urban analytics capable to support decision when supporting decision with data. And lastly, this idea of defining patches is not something new. So if we look into classic urban morphology, we find the concept of morphological regions. And our goal here is to learn from it, rethink, and reapply its key premises. Because originally the concept, as we're going to see, it was developed for a small area in the city, like it's a neighborhood, but now we are reapplying the concept to the city scale. So if you allow me, we have here the definition of morphological regions. I will read it. So it is the identification of unitary areas which comprise an individualized combination of the three basic form complexes, delimited by their degree of internal morphological similarity. So here I highlighted two key terms, individual combination and morphological similarity. Morphological similarity, you already can grasp the idea of similar types, so similar things, and an individualized combination. So we are looking specifically at each element of, it can be the building, it can be the plot, it can be the street network. So each element separately and later combining them. So these are two pivotal ideas that we'll be reconnecting later on in the method. One thing that it's important to highlight is the concept of type, because you'll be listening this word quite often throughout the whole presentation. And when I say type, I refer to a typomorphology, that is a way to describe and to explain how the built environment is produced by classifying systematically the elements due to their form or configuration, whatever the criteria is, but also often including the historic process of its development. So that's the idea of type, connecting to the historico-geographical approach. So the historic process of cities. So there's no relation to, for example, the Italian school of urban morphology, the typological process of development. So that's not the idea. We're just focusing on type within the historical geographical approach. So by saying that, we can move on to the framework of the morphological region. So when the concept was created and by whom. So the idea of morphological regions was a concept developed by Konzen. He's a German geographer in the late 50s. And the question of how to articulate and to represent the structure of the urban landscape has been central to geographical urban morphology. And exactly between the 50s and late 80s, Konzen made his major contribution to the development of morphological regionalization, the method, a process of mapping homogeneous regions of type that is fundamental to the understanding of the structure of change of cities. So his initial work started in Aulick in the 60s, and the final morphological regions, so it's a process, his final work was in 1988. As you can see, the idea of morphological region is a historical geographical concept, meaning that it is based on the cartographic but also chronological analysis of the changes of the morphological elements of the city and how they change, how they transform throughout time. Okay, so central idea when we look at the whole process of identifying these regions, but also the concept, we find out that there are two keystones here. First, there is a hierarchy. Yeah. So this hierarchy will be used in the identification of types. And the second one is that this hierarchy is also represented when defining the regions. So let's take, for example, the urban form complexes that it's a way of creating layers of analysis of the city. So we start with the town plan. Secondly, we have the building fabric and land and building utilization. These urban form complexes, they are directly related to the degree of persistence of its elements. So we see that this hierarchy of elements and persistence also reflected in the regions, where the foundational layer, so layer 1, we have the most persistent elements of the town plan, followed by the building, and lastly, the land utilization. So these are the most important and perhaps the premises, we could call it like that, the premises we are borrowing and learning from in order to improve quantitative classification. So as I mentioned, we'll be using these two pivotal ideas, the combination and the hierarchy. And we are looking specifically at 4 elements, which we'll discuss thoroughly later, just to highlight. So we're looking at blocks and the street network, the plots and the buildings, and the combination of the 4. So our proposal here is to define a hierarchical combination of these types aggregated within one existing element in order to objectively identify these morphological homogeneous tissues. And this is one aspect that also differs from the current approaches to urban form classification, since we are classifying individual types and in separate layers, and also aggregating them within one existing element, which will be the block. We'll discuss it in a second. So here I present the research objective, the general research objective, which is to develop an algorithmic method to define urban patterns based on a hierarchical combination of typological descriptions of urban form components. And now we'll go through the steps. So this big objective will be divided into some procedures. So the method is divided into 4 parts, and there are 2 exercises in the end. The first part, we'll be discussing about the elements. What are the elements we're looking at and measuring? Second, how the aggregation takes place into the form of a hierarchical analysis. Thirdly, we're looking at the representation, so essentially the cartographic preparation for each one of the layers. Next, we have our variables, so the process of selecting the set of variables. And the 5th step is actually exercise 1, which will focus just on the variables that were used. And 6th will be our case for the combination of types and testing this hierarchical approach. So we're going to start with our elements. As I mentioned before, we're looking at 4 independent elements, so blocks and the street network, the plots and the buildings. This hierarchy of elements, it also reflects Cozen's perspective and point of view when it comes to the persistence of the elements in the city. So we have the blocks in the street network as the most persistent elements, followed by the plots and later on the buildings. Well, connected to that, I'd like to highlight the blocks and the street network, because from these 2 elements, we will derive our spatial unit of analysis, where we're going to aggregate all the numeric information. So by combining the layers of the blocks and the street network, and also water bodies and railway, we get to define our what we call as graphes or pre-blocks using a primary representation of the street network. And the representation of that is the urban block to, let's say, make it visually more friendly. But essentially, the most important element here is the graphes, which will aggregate all the information. So just to clarify, what is the pre-block that I'll be referring to in the following steps. Okay, so once we understand what I call as a pre-block, it comes one very important aspect in the method, the definition of our spatial unit of analysis. So the element that will carry all the information in the clustering. So we know that there is a compositional hierarchy of levels of scale implied in the urban grain, what alludes to repeating patterns of street blocks, plots, buildings, and so on. So the built environment is perhaps more accurately characterized by overlapping sets rather than rigidly rooted sets. If we look to this to the diagram here, we're going to notice that the pre-blocks are in between these two levels. So what is happening outside? Yeah, the block level. So we have the street network and the junctions. So this is one side. And what is happening also inside of the block, the intra-block level, where we have parcel and buildings. Therefore, if we create a pre-block ID, all this information in between these two systems, they can be combined into the pre-block. So that's the main idea of aggregating all this information into one existing element of the city. So we will find pre-blocks in every city. So that's the idea. So once our aggregation, our spatial unit of aggregation is established, we're now looking at the layers of the classification. So it also, there's a direct relation to what Coulson did to his work, where we separate the elements. So we'll start with the first level, the bidimensional form of the block, where we combine street network and the pre-blocks. Next, the second level of the hierarchy is the parcel, so the plot pattern. And lastly, we have the third level, the build pattern, where we're looking at the building with the 2D information, but also 3D, which is the height. So based on that, we can define, as an example here, pre-block types. Type 1, for example, the plot type 1 and the building type 1. So we create let's say a combination, yeah, of a sequence in order to identify the types within the different layers. So this will be we'll go back to this in a second. So once we have the layers, we have the spatial unit of analysis. Now it's time to start working with our layers, and they were all downloaded from official authorities, so they are open source data. And before actually running all the procedures and calculating all the measures, we went through a data manipulation in GIS. So in order to clean the data, and we collected our case studies. I like to call them our urban lab. There were 3 different cities and one final case study. So we collected data from Birmingham, Amsterdam, Istanbul, and São Paulo. Now we're looking at the final set of variables, which is about 42 variables, considering the 3 layers. Before we go through the original variables, there was an exercise to narrow down to this 42, but we'll be checking that in a second. So the street network and the pre-blocks, they are, let's say, pure measures, while parcels and building footprints, they are aggregated measures into the block. And in order to run all the analysis and calculate all the measures, we also used model builder in GIS to make it in order to run and calculate all the measures in a more systematic way. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for, in a systematic way, and that we could reproduce the same thing throughout the whole cases. And one aspect here that is essential is the structure of the method, which is our morphological elements and our measures. They are flexible in the sense that you can add, for instance, another layer, vegetation, or perhaps any some social aspect, economic aspects. And also our cluster method, which we'll see next, it's also flexible, it can be changed. But one keys down here, what is fixed is our hierarchy, so the levels, the combination of types, and our spatial unit of analysis. Because a quite common question that I get is, but if you don't have the plots, which is hard to find quite often, well, you can substitute, maybe you don't have to use it. So it depends on your goal. So what is fixed is the hierarchy and the combination in between the layers in the spatial unit, which is the pre-block. So once we have the variables, how to combine them, and our spatial unit of analysis, we go to the first exercise, which is regarding our morphological measures. As I told you before, there are tons of variables, and we had to select a few of them in order to run the classification. So our goal here was to look at what constants did in order to guide in the to have some guidance in the process of selecting the most let's say similar variables. So the first exercise is it aims to identify which are the morphological characteristics that should be measured in order to differentiate patterns of each element. So originally we had a pack of 67 measures, considering all 4 elements, and we were able to narrow down to 42, as I mentioned before. To run this exercise, we used a technique called purposeful sampling, which is hand-picking examples that best illustrate the morphological traits we are interested in. So we selected, let's say, we visually analyzed and selected patterns which also corresponded to historical, reflected the historical development of the city. So these classes that we selected, they reflect the historical development of the city. And we did the same procedure for Amsterdam, Birmingham, Istanbul. Our goal here is that we have classes from completely different cities, so different historical background, and we needed to ensure that they were different in order to verify if our measures could be applied within the method would work in different contexts. So once that was established, for example, here we have the list of variables for the buildings, the original list, and the final set. As you can see, it was reduced. So we first started with analyzing the correlation between all the variables. So from there, we could already eliminate the ones who were telling the same story. Let's put it like that. Next, we used the PCA analysis to check the components, what are the main components, and the factor analysis to find the loading of each variable in the components. In doing so, we understood what were, let's say, the most important variables in the process in order to run the clustering algorithm and classify our 75 cases within the 3 cities. In the end, what we got was the final set of variables. Always, it's important remark is this process was developed within the 3 different elements. So we did the same thing for the pre-block, separately for the parcel, and separately for the building. So we get all the elements and their variables in the specific sets. So once that was concluded, now we jump into the second exercise. We have the measures, but now we have to learn how to combine them, how to aggregate them into the block, and how to combine these different layers in order to derive our regions. So the second exercise aimed to classify the 4 components of the urban form independently in GIS and to combine their types to delimit the regions. Again, our case studies were Istanbul, Amsterdam, and Birmingham. But now instead of single tiny cases, we had bigger samples from each city. So I'll be presenting the one from Istanbul, but the same procedure was done to Amsterdam and Birmingham as well. So at this point, we're already classified. Here we have the clustering solution for the blocks, for the plot pattern, and for the buildings, each one of the layers. And something that was quite interesting, and it's a whole other way to analyze, but it's interesting to mention, is that as we're using GMM as a clustering method, because it can essentially deal with different sizes and shapes, variables with different sizes and shapes, but it also provides us a probabilistic output, so it's not deterministic. And by doing that, what we get, we could call them as transitional types. So blocks which are not 100% of type A and not 100% from type B. It's in between one and the other. So this is also a very interesting aspect to be explored. It's not our goal, but it's quite interesting to mention. So we get to see these transitional blocks, for example, and they are usually placed where we can, let's say, visually identify that it's there's a transition from one type to another. So for example, here the probability indicates, we can see in lighter gray, these transitional blocks. So just something interesting to mention. But going back now to the combination of types. So in the first layer, we have 3 clusters of pre-blocks. In the second, we have 5 clusters of plots. And in the third layer, we have 4 clusters of buildings. And our initial assumption is this is just a mathematical problem. We can call it permutation or combination. There are 60 possible combinations in total. But as we verify, as we try to combine, actually we notice that some combinations are more frequent than others, and some combinations do not take place in the city. So by doing this, we can assume that the higher frequencies of combinations, they represent the most common patterns, whereas the lower frequencies of combinations, they represent the least common urban patterns in the city. And as I mentioned before, there is we can count the number, the frequency, as it is shown here in the histograms, the frequency of the combinations, and we can clearly see that some of them occur frequently and others perhaps do not even take place. And with that, we can establish our regions of patterns. The colors here, they represent the frequency of the combination. So how often do they occur? From block 1, from block 2, and from block 3. As you recall, I told you that our block is the spatial unit of analysis. The pre-block, sorry, is our spatial unit of analysis. So from the three, we can create all the combinations. That's why what you see here, it's the frequency according to from each block. Okay. So for example, the block 3, which do not have high frequencies of combinations, it has just one order. Whereas the first and the second, we have the most frequent combinations in red here in the histograms, and the ones that do not occur so often in blue. So now that the method is in place, we get to zoom in and analyze a specific case here, for example, just to illustrate. So from one specific combination, which is 2, 1, 4, so block type 2, plot type 1, and building type 4, we get to build the characteristics of our region of our type. So according to the block and street network, the plots and the building, and the morphological and topological description of it. There's just a 3D view to illustrate the heights, so that we can visualize the difference. So now that the method is in place, it's time to test all these procedures in a much larger case study, which is São Paulo. We selected a simple area of 10 kilometers diameter, sorry. And this area, I don't know if most of you have been to São Paulo. It's central area of São Paulo. There's the historical core here. So, but of course, it's just a tiny sample of the city compared to the whole perimeter of the city. So again, we ran the clustering for each element separately. We used the GMM clustering. We ran it like 10 rounds of it just to double check if the big value was consistent to define the number of clusters. So the same thing was done to the blocks, the same thing was done to the plots, and the same procedures for the buildings. Okay. Now it's the time, it's the moment where we also, here I'm just using one example, the buildings, but we also analyzed the profile of each cluster. So for example, here we have the buildings, and we can observe how the variables behave in each one of the clusters. And now we look at the combinations. So as we have 6 pre-block clusters, we also have here the 6 histograms with the possible combinations found in each block. So again, we have the most frequent ones represented in red, and the ones which are not frequent or do not happen at all in blue. Based on that, we can again establish orders. So the most frequent ones are order 1, and the least frequent one are order 2. Okay, so here we have the regions of types, the morphological regions from São Paulo. So again, most of our blocks, they have 2 orders, which again represent the frequency of the combinations, and just block 5, which is doesn't have a very significant, let's say, number of frequencies. So there's just 1 order of region. So if we zoom into some specific cases, just to exemplify, for example, the pink or brownish color, we have 3 possible combinations: cluster of block 6, plots 2 and 1, and the same thing, 6, 6, 3, 1, 6, 3, 2. Here I'm exemplifying the combination block 6, plots 3, and building 1, We have the morphological and topological information about it, and the view in 3D. And the same thing goes for the blue, which is number 2, and the green region in number 3. So some considerations after running all the method and the analysis in 4 cities. So we try to learn from a classic and robust concept in urban morphology. We, of course, acknowledge the importance of urban morphology in the understanding of the city form. And the concepts from classic urban morphology, they can be instrumental in modern urban studies. More specifically, we can learn from them in order to improve quantitative methods. Also, the use of a hierarchical approach to combine the urban typomorphologies. By building on these classic foundations of using a hierarchical approach, which allows it allowed a more structured understanding of how these different urban typologies, they combine and interact at various levels of scale. And we also understood that we can emphasize the importance of combining these types to achieve a more holistic perspective of the city form development. Also, this is the first contribution to the operationalization of morphological regions in GIS. And the method was validated and also generalized in completely different contexts in Istanbul, Birmingham, Amsterdam, and São Paulo. And this shows that the approach is not limited to a single location, but has a broad applicability, which strengthens the concept of morphological regions. But of course, there are limitations and flexibilities. When I mention flexibility, it's the fact that we have flexible layers of analysis. As I mentioned before, you could add vegetation or any other aspects you want to have as an input in the classification. But we also acknowledge as a limitation that while urban typomorphological processes are highly valuable, they are also place-based and context-specific. So note that while the hierarchical and GIS-based method allows for broad applications, like local conditions, history, culture will always shape the particularities of the city's form. So if you decide to apply in another case study, you might need to review the variables you're using, the layers you have available, and so on. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.